So now we're on page 20, the staffing pattern. What you're going to want to do is break out the tasks for the project into short job descriptions. And you want to describe the role of paid staff, what their responsibilities are, who they report to, who they supervise, what percentage of their time they'll spend working on the project. Now, someone had a question for me about that during the break, about the percentages and them adding up. When I talked about that earlier, what I meant is each individual, when you look at the organization as a whole and all your different projects you may be doing, each individual is only 100% of a person. So if you have them spending 50%, this is the same person, 50% of their time on one project and 50% of their time on another project, then they can't be spending another 50% of their time on a third project, because that adds up to 150. And you only have one person 100%. But between the different people, it doesn't matter what it adds up to. Does that make sense? It didn't make sense. Okay, she asks, is it a percentage of time? It's a percentage of their time as well as generally, when you're doing the percentage, you're talking about a full-time staff person. So whatever full-time is to your organization. So would be 50% of their time as well as 50% of their salary. So let me try that again. All right, let's say your organization only has one project, and you have a program director. They're spending 100% of their time on that one project. Now you add a second project. They can't spend 100% of their time on the first project and 100% of their time on the second project. It's not logically possible. So that's what I'm saying, that when you have an individual across different projects, you need to make sure that you're not allocating them 40% here, 60% here, 30% here, that adds up to more time than they could humanly do. Does that make sense now? Okay. Okay, I mentioned already having advisory committee members. I'm back on page 20. 7B. Then the next thing you'll want to include is brief biographies about the qualifications of staff consultants, key volunteers, if you have any advisors. So you'd write maybe a paragraph about their background, but then you'll want to also attach their resumes. Then C, describe the role of volunteers. This is only if you have volunteers in key positions, then you want detail about what they'll be doing. But if you have, let's say, 20 tutors, you don't have to get into detail about each and every individual tutor. You just talk generally about what the tutors will be doing. Okay, then you want to have an organizational chart for your entire staff as well as for the project staff. So there are two organizational chart samples in this document. Okay, on to page 21, the budget. And there's a sample budget there. But again, you would need to do the budget in whatever format the funder asks for. For federal grants, they have a form that you need to fill out, so you need to follow those guidelines. But here, I'm just generally speaking what's in there. The project expenses, which would be your salaries, the program expenses, and then any administrative or overhead office expenses. That would be items like the accountant, rent of your office space, not rent for, if you're renting a room to host a meeting that's an integral part of the project, that's a project expense. But your expense for your general rental of office is an administrative expense. You may also want to list project income, which would be other grants, and then indicate whether or not that grant has already been approved or the application is still pending. And sometimes you might have program income. If you're conducting workshops, let's say, and you're charging people $20 to come to the workshops, then that should be reflected in the budget, how much money you think you'll get through that. Let's see. I'm not going to go through all of this, but one of the important things on here is to make sure that your dollar amounts are real and reasonable figures. By that I mean don't guess that, well, maybe it'll cost me $1,000 to print this up. Call the printer, tell them you're trying to do a document that's 20 pages long, that's in color or that's just black and white, that has this type of cover. Find out what it's going to cost, because you may be way off. So you don't want to end up budgeting $1,000 for some document, and then you find out after you get the grant that it costs you $5,000 to produce it, and now you don't have enough money to do what you said you were going to do. You're not going to be able to go back to the foundation and say, oops, made a mistake, give me $4,000 more. So make sure that when you're doing your budget, you really research the figures and make sure that they're reasonable. With something like printing, you may want to get quotes from a few different places, because the first place you call may not be reasonable. And if you don't go get printing services all the time, you may not know that the quote they're giving you is not reasonable. I'm going to skip down to, well, no, let me keep going through all of them. Item D, include budget notes where appropriate to explain how you arrived at your figures and what materials or services the figure encompasses. And that, to use the same example, if you have $1,000 for your publication, then you want to say that that means you're going to make 100 copies of a 20-page document that's black and white. You want, details of what exactly that covers. Administrative and fundraising expenses combined should comprise less than 35% of the total budget. This is, remember back earlier I talked about the Better Business Bureau has standards for charities. This is one of their standards of how much money they believe is reasonable for a nonprofit organization to spend on fundraising and administration versus actual program expenses. So you want to look at those guidelines and try to just keep to those guidelines. Sometimes it's not possible to meet them for various good reasons, but you still want to know what they are and try to meet them. Then also some funders want to know what your long-term fundraising plans are. So if you have already established what your fundraising goals are, then, and I believe that was in one of the sections that we skipped over, so you can look at that later on. But if you've already established your goals, then you'll be able to explain how you expect to continue to raise money. Okay, we talked already about doing a clear and descriptive title and the table of contents and the abstract. Okay, any questions? Yes. There is an example, but it's in the part that we skipped over. Let's see. It's on page 10. Because of time, I'm not going to go over that in detail. Okay, let's skip over to page 26. The part that we're skipping over talks more about editing and formatting the proposal, and you can just read that on your own.